Well, thank you, everybody. I had the pleasure of spending a month in Europe in their lovely summer, very hot summer. I went to England and Scotland, and the Scots told us how much they loved this new, warmer climate in the climate change that they're experiencing. Lots of changes to agriculture. They're trialing new wheat varieties because it's just too hot for what they've traditionally been using. In France, in Bordeaux, one of the most famous wine growing regions of the world, they're actually struggling in these warmer conditions and they're replanting vines that have been there for hundreds of years now with olive trees. And on the farm tour, absolute chaos in the agricultural markets. The Brexit own goal, farmers all over are absolutely struggling. On the bee front, the UK's had Varroa since about 1992 and France since about 1982. So what I saw and what I'd like to share with you today is really the post-Varroa arrival phase of the world, in both cases 30, 40, 50 years later. So in those 4 weeks, England and Scotland saw very, very few Apis mellifera, lots and lots of bumblebees. And what we're seeing in the government push is to protect habitat. So farmers get subsidies to produce or maintain wildflower fields or hedgerows and plant them to attract and support pollinators. So the bumblebees you will see everywhere, they're those heavy jumbo jet bees. Basically, I hardly saw any Apis mellifera. I'll give you the number on the next slide. So the bumblebees are big news over there, the heavy jumbo jets. They've got 24 species, and yet they're also struggling with the impact of pesticides, loss of habitat, and agricultural burdens. And so, yeah, 8 are rare and declining. Interestingly, they aren't affected by Varroa because their life cycle is very different to the Apis mellifera. And they're fleeting and seasonal, and the queen survives on her own to get started again in the next spring. So interestingly, they are not affected by Varroa, but they can spread the deformed wing virus. Now off to the southeast of France near the mountains, a cool, temperate climate, not unlike our conditions here, which is cold winters and potentially quite hot summers. I worked with this beekeeper called Eduardo, who's been a beekeeper since he was a 15-year-old, nearly 30 years. Varroa has been in his beekeeping life his entire career. Importantly, he's actually dedicated to organic beekeeping. So very interesting set of challenges that he faces. He's based here at this glacier lake that's fed from the Rhone River. And yes, freezing to low 30s. Quite irregular rainfall. He said basically June and October is what they expect to get their rain. So what he's doing is to qualify for organic in the French system, at least half of the areas he uses must be described as wild fields. And he produces 14 different varieties, and he does move his hives. So he moves them from around his more flat area near the lake up to the mountains. This is an integral part of his Varroa management, which is that he uses 2 treatments, maybe 3 if work allows, because as tell us later, it's a huge time impost managing Varroa. He doesn't lose hives to Varroa, and he puts that down to a few things, but one of which is absolute vigilance. He says, yes, they do still have swarms, but the swarms, in his experience, only really survive for about 1 year before they die out from Varroa. Also said that no one's actually talking about Varroa, and he sees that some of the older beekeepers are really struggling, and they're still in that generational change, he felt, between coping with Varroa and not coping with Varroa. So that was a very interesting observation. Here's an example of one of his local sites. You can actually see the bees, which was a big excitement because I had seen 4 Apis mellifera in 4 weeks, 4 single bees in the whole of 2 countries. So it was great to see them. They were going very, very well. With things he does, he's a mix of the old and the new school. He uses his hive lids for records. He keeps paper records, which he writes up between apiary visits. And he really loves the weight monitor sensor that he puts on select drops, especially in the mountains, which could be a 3 or 4 hour drive away. So he's able to see, as you can see from that middle picture, he can see the weight gain, and he can know whether it's appropriate to make that long trip to the hives in the mountains to bring them back. For him, it's all about strong hives. So it's been there his whole life. He's had to manage, had to do all this. And he says it's absolutely critical that his hives be extremely strong. So he's always watching to split hives or combine hives and make sure they are strong. And we just went on this random check to this site, and it was a pretty remarkable site of these beautiful, strong colonies, neatly kept, one of the neatest apiaries I've seen. One of their product lines is pollen collection. So he showed me what he does there. He will limit the pollen collection to a few weeks just because obviously it takes away from the bees benefiting from that. So he will do that, and that's very popular in France. Now, I mentioned the hive sensor that shows the weight of the gain of the hives in distant locations. And because he really has to just be very strict with his whole timetable, he does make use of a dehumidifying chamber system he set up. It's quite a simple area. You can see a room there with a pull-down curtain, and he puts his boxes in there for some weeks sometimes to get them down to the correct harvesting levels. I remember Krista and Carl spoke about this the previous Zoom. Anyway, it gives him flexibility to collect the hives, even if they're not all absolutely ready. It absolutely is central to his workflow and running a business to be able to do that. So he uses that successfully. He's been through the whole range of Varroa treatment options, and here are just some of the examples he pulled out of his cupboard to show what he's tried, what he feels might work. And in the end, what he settled on is to use the oxalic acid dribble. And there I've written down how much he uses, which is pretty comparable with the advice we have in Australia for our use of oxalic acid dribble. For him, he likes to look inside the hive. He has tried the sublimators or the vaporizers, but in the end, he likes to look inside the hive, even though one of the treatments is in their colder weather. I mentioned earlier that him moving his hives to the mountains is important as part of his Varroa treatment. The other is moving his hives to a lavender field. And what he does is create that brood break, and he kills any remnant brood, then treats them. And this is a very successful method, but you can see it's really hinging on migration to a field where brood is not part of that whole life cycle. And then in winter, he will fit another one in, again, looking inside the hive. Conditions could be cool. And if workflow allows it, he'll pop in a third treatment or a second winter treatment. So that's how he manages. He asked to keep in touch with us. He's absolutely keen to find new and better ways to keep managing Varroa. He's very concerned about Varroa. As he says later, it just takes an enormous amount of time. Eduardo makes it look easy, but that's because he's just highly competent, really particular, and adores his bees. He loves every aspect of the beekeeper journey. He loves making boxes. He loves driving in his truck. He loves harvesting, and he loves talking to people, because France is a place in rural or regional France. It's a place where people are really committed to their local produce. We'll talk a bit about that in a moment. This is just his team of seasonal workers who do all the extraction and juice the bottled honey for local sale. Very, very strong support. And this is just one example of where you'll go to this little shop in the middle of some little town, and here there's market some days, and then there's this ongoing store where all this local honey is sold and gets enormous support for the organic element. So to wrap up, yes, he has 500 hives. That's quite a large number. Typically, beekeeping in France, he says, is about 300 hives. Often a couple run the show. He's doing it on his own. But he is very concerned. What his environment is, there are virtually no feral honeybees. It's essential for him to run brood breaks and to exploit that. And of course, he makes absolute use. His whole process depends on having those isolated hive locations. So he's not getting cross-infection or infestation from other bees, from other beekeepers. But he's a cheery, competent, capable beekeeper. And he did say, wow, it takes a lot of time to treat Varroa, too much time. So he's looking to us, please, let's find some way to, whether it's breeding the great queen or whatever method it's going to be. He did hope that we would be able to collaborate globally to help manage Varroa in a more effective way. And that's it, France.
Jamie, you've got a question, please?
Yeah. Hi, Krista. With brood breaks, does he do any queen caging or how does he create that? Or is it just purely by splitting or doing that sort of thing? How's his
Oh,
brood
you're
break?
absolutely right, Jamie. He does a traditional brood break in terms of caging the queen. He also talked about destroying any remnant. When he goes off to lavender, he destroys any remnant brood. So he wants to make sure he's taking a clean load up to lavender where they are brood free. So he's caged the queen, he's killed remnant brood, and then he takes the whole lot with the queen up to the lavender. So I don't know how long he cages the queen for, but my understanding was it was nothing particularly unusual there.
Louise, you've got a question or comment. Thanks.
How does he cope with organic certification if he's using oxalic acid or the likes?
Well, I believe there is testing of products, a bit like us. It's random. You get the inspectors coming in and testing. And he gave the impression it's a little bit loose, but he is quite confident about his system. I mean, oxalic is an accepted organic product because it's not a synthetic miticide. So it is in Australia too. If you use those products, the idea is that they will still be recognized as part of an organic system. So in France, he says that there are those tests and he keeps records, which he can then justify. But he did say to some extent he wonders if it's a little bit loose, but he knows what he does.
Thanks for that, Krista.
Well, I can see a question about the lavender breaks works.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure how lavender works, Diana. I don't really know enough about that. It must be a place where the bees aren't strongly laying down more brood because he can exploit that opportunity. So I'm not really across lavender particularly.
Right. Yeah, no, it just sounded very interesting. It must be just something to different with the flowers, whether they.
Well, I think that's right. Maybe it's not very pro-brood.
No, it's okay. What he's relying on is a brood rake. Then he puts them on the lever to build up again. Without much brood to start with, they bring in a lot of nectar. That's what he's using it for that. So brood break can be anything from a maximum of up to 18 days. So you've got everything emerging. You've got a whole lot of bees. Treat before that, and then the brood comes and you just put the boxes on. They've just got no brood to look after, very little. So they'll actually just bring in a lot of nectar.
Right. Thank you, Frank. Yes.
So, Diana, you've got a question or comment, please?
Well, I just had a comment. Thank you for the sort of insight into the whole agricultural thing, because it seems to, sometimes I think people just don't take the whole climate changing thing seriously enough, how far it's affecting everything.
Well, it was odd. I was with a group of beef producers from Australia, and they'd hear all this stuff from all these research places we went to saying the climate, we've got data for these many decades, we can see an absolute trend. And yet amongst certain groups, there is still absolute denial about this. So it was quite an odd situation, but certainly, we met farmers all across England and Scotland who are saying this is a reality and we've been here 50 years. We know it's different. Yeah, Brexit's been a tragedy for the agricultural sector. And now there's a new government that has introduced inheritance tax. So farmers are really struggling. The markets have been decimated. They've got no European market, which they're desperately trying to rebuild. So, yeah, it's a really tough time, very tough time to be a farmer. I'm glad we're not English farmers.
No, very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Krista, for the presentation and for the questions.